Isaac Sarason is a skilled hacker, formerly employed by British Telecom-Sprint. When his health failed, Isaac did the only thing he could think of. He ran. He found a haven in a working-class district of the city known as Little Russia. There Isaac took on a new name, Ishmael. He then became embroiled in the affairs of a brutal member of the Lamadiza organized crime family, known as Leo. Convinced by his longtime friend Frankie to flee from his commitments to the Lamadiza family, Isaac found himself hunted by the ruthless Leo. On a rooftop, far from witnesses, Leo murdered Frankie. Only through the use of his skills as a hacker was Isaac able to drive Leo off. Wounded, alone, and far from help, Isaac depended on the kindness of strangers. One stranger, a burqa-wearing doctor known as Fatima, took pity on Isaac and helped him make his way to the mysterious Star X line. At the end of all hope, they found the Star X line and the slim promise that the enigmatic beings behind the Star X could save Isaac from the implants which destroyed his life. What do you do when those who saved you have recorded everything you are? What do you do when your every action is tracked by the Keylogger? Colbyjack.net is proud to present Firmware Keylogger, the third installment in the Firmware Pentology by Colbytrax. 00-00-11. I tossed and turned in a nightmare. No, not a nightmare. More like a series of dreams. But the series were in parallel. How could I dream simultaneously of three? No, make that four different things. In one dream, I waxed poetically at the unfairness of a world which didn't make itself interesting for me. In another, I journeyed to a base on the far side of the moon, or was it the far side refuge on the dark side of the moon, in a thundering rocket launch from the Henry Koenig International Airport. How absurd. Then there was the third dream, an endless loop of tea with Fatima where the world kept realigning itself to fix the details missed in an earlier iteration. All the while, I knew I was slowly coming to realize that I was dying somewhere on a table in an operating theater. All of which was wrong, of course. I was not dying on an operating table. I was not going to the moon. And I most definitely wasn't whining about the injustices of a world of plenty and peace where I had the good fortune to not be born in a bad part of. You know, the part with plenty and peace, and not one of the shitholes scattered across the globe where people still had to worry about where their next meal came. And whether their soy was really soy or made of something worse. Yeah, I was living in the best world there was, and nothing could prevent me from living my life to the fullest. Not the suits on the 111th floor of the British Telecom-Sprint, BTS corporate headquarters, not Murray with his desk like a ship, not the goons in security, employment, retention, and recovery, Sarar, not the psycho Leo, or the renegade hacker Masbana. None of these entities, people, and corporations could stop me from finding Nona and my unborn child. This was a certainty I knew to be an actuality. There are things which are facts. The sky is blue, grass is green, and the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Each of these facts are based in turn on a series of assumptions. To see the sky is blue and the grass is green, we have to agree to view the world with a certain range of perceptions and equipment. We need to use eyes with the same design and have to agree to name certain wavelengths certain ways. As for the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, that too is a conceptual framework in which the dominant culture, Igrish speakers, and before them English speakers, have chosen to define the direction the sun comes up as east. Since those Proto-Igrish speakers who defined the direction came from the northern hemisphere and defined east as being the direction 90 degrees to the right of the top of a map with the North Pole at the top and west being the other direction. Thus the sun comes up in the east. If we turn the map upside down and define the South Pole as the top, with east being 90 degrees to the right of the top, then the sun will come up in the west. It all depends on your definitions. In the case of Nona, there was the fact that she was missing. Ever since the police stormed the nesting doll looking for her, she had been missing. My last memory of her was a single frame of a video feed where she, in a blurry form, disappeared into the under-road network. Why had I been so narrow-minded? Why had I not been able to see the complexity of the events around me? Why had I been complacent about there being more than one way out of the nesting doll? So much of my life was defined by what I didn't know, what I couldn't control. Maybe it was time to change that, to dig deeper, to learn all there was to know. In the past, I had excuses for every one of my failures of judgment, my leap before I look moments, my ready, fire, aim moments, and with the mistakes at the nesting doll, there had been a good excuse as well. I had been in a bed, dying from bad wiring installed in my head by my previous employer, BTS. But that had been no reason to ignore the fact that in any sane neighborhood, Nona would have been a little more than a year away from her majority. In any normal neighborhood, she would have been choosing a college or tech school, getting a part-time job at the bodega on the corner, or seeking out an apprenticeship. Her family should be planning her high school graduation party. She and her friends should be looking for their first apartment, and all the adventures went with the end of home and the beginning of life. Instead, she had killed a man. Yes, the man had attempted to rape her, and she had killed him with nothing more than a sharpened toothbrush. Wait a minute. I never got a good look at what she held in her hand. Or did I? I thought back on the scene. The man on top of her, her right hand hidden beneath a pillow. I felt my view shift as I remembered how her hand had flashed from beneath the pillow. I stopped the memory and examined the object in her hand. I rotated around the object. There had been a multitude of cameras focused on that bed. Between them all, it would have been little effort to whip up a three-dimensional model. It was through such a model I moved in my memories. Yep, it had been a toothbrush. You could make out the brand name faintly along the back of the former brush turned to a Life of Knife. I chuckled. Life of Knife. That was a good one. Nona was strong enough to not only shank her rapist, but had the forethought to make the shank out of what was at hand. How had she sharpened it? What trials did she put herself through in order to make it without discovery? I rewound my memory across the room. I imagined events I had never seen, but knew had to be actualities, events which actually happened and were not subject to negotiation of meaning, flowed past me. I witnessed one man in a fine silk suit, the pants crumpled about his knees, his face pressed against the floor as Nona kicked him over and over, her bare heels covered in blood. Not her blood, no, the man on the floor owned the blood. I imagined hospital reports on the man. Ruptured gonads, collapsed lung, ruptured eardrums, and orbital blowout fractures were his most notable injuries. I tutted at the cost in jewels it took for Leo to make him whole. But then again, even with the miracles possible in this day and age, not every bit of damage could be reversed. He would always suffer some hearing loss, which could be alleviated through implants, as well as being at risk of developing a sunken eye. In fact, every time he blew his nose, he might feel a little reminder of Nona's not-so-gentle method of persuasion. I leapt forward through events, driven to find how Nona had made her shiv. I ran through minutes and hours faster and faster until the room was a gray blur of night, day, neon, night, day, neon. I stopped. I saw Nona smile as she sharpened a chunk of dental hygienic extruded epoxy into its final form in the dark of the night. Her face was a welter of bruises. She didn't seem to mind. With a rictus grin, she worked on the toothbrush turned shiv. How had she gotten those bruises? I jumped back until I saw David standing beside the door. David Shakava was a man I expected to see whenever something nasty was going down. He was the nephew of the evil bastard Leo Shakava, and guilty of selling me out to BTS's corporate talent recovery teams. Seeing him near a camera associated with Nona told me nothing good was going down. I was right. David stood staring, with interest bordering on derangement, while two tailor-suited gentlemen beat Nona. These men were professionals, The precision of their strikes shone in sharp contrast to the unrestrained violence Nona had unleashed on her attempted rapist. Their strikes hit with a constancy of strength and accuracy bordering on the mechanical. They took turns holding her. The taller two appeared to specialize in torso strikes. Not once did he strike her above the clavicle, nor did he strike her below the last lumbar vertebrae. When the shorter of the pair took his turn, it became apparent he had his own specialty. His strikes, exquisitely aimed and weighted, were focused on her face. The power of his blows was well within accepted parameters for creating painful bruises without causing lasting damage. When they were done, they left her on the floor, the ruin of her room lying all around her. They left her alone, on the floor of that room, and went on to drink heartily at the Red Square across the street, only a handful of minutes later. Nona struggled up and recovered her shiv from where she had hidden it. It must be noted that Nona was lucky that her torturers hadn't struck her below the last lumbar vertebrae. If they had, her own shiv would have killed her. What had caused the beating? I scanned back through the visual memories of things I had never seen. Then I spotted it. Nona had forced the window open. She had a chair stuck up against the door, her bed jammed in place by the arrangement of the chair and her bookcase. She stood at the window and threw things out. Bottles of personal hygiene products, combs, mirrors, brushes, and many other personal items went out the window. Outside her room, the tall goon and the short goon beat against the door. I saw David in the hall behind them. He was imploring them to try harder through slaps to the head and a large amount of yelling. By the time the trio in the hall began to work together, throwing their weight at the door in unison, Nona had run out of things which would fit through the open window. The chair failed under the combined mass of the three men throwing themselves against the offending door. It cracked and shifted, allowing the short one to slip through the gap in the door. He was rewarded for being first with a kick to the genitals. Unfortunately for Nona, the short one was ready for her. He leaned into her kick and took it in the belly instead of his delicate bits. He folded his body around her foot, dragging Nona to the floor. The tall one climbed in next and took advantage of Nona's inferior position to lift her from the floor, ending all further resistance. A few minutes later, the beating started. But why had she done this thing? Why had she taken the beating? I went a bit further back. There she sat examining every item in her room which could be turned into a weapon. In the end, she settled on the toothbrush and began to carve it down using the blades of a disposable razor to scrape the plastic into shape. I saw her look down at the pile of shavings on the floor, and a glimmer of resignation cross her face. I imagined the thoughts crossing her mind. She had to be realizing the toothbrush would be missed and the plastic embedded in the blades of the razor, as well as the pile of tailings on the floor, would end in her losing her only weapon. Then she smiled and looked at the window, and I knew all of what was to come to pass. She had blocked the door and then forced the window. Soon she was raining toiletries down onto Tbilisi Avenue, 33 stories below. Soon she would be beaten, but she would have her shiv. A shiv she would need in a few weeks to commit her first murder. Nona was tough and resilient. She would survive, and I would locate her. There are many facts in the world, but finding Nona was not one. It was an actuality. I would find her, if only in my dreams. Firmware Keylogger is the third book in the firmware pentology. That's 5 books, if you must know. It begins where Firmware Proxy ends, which in turn followed on the heels of Firmware Hijacked. So you haven't heard or read Firmware Hijacked or Proxy, this would be a great time to head on over to Colbyjack.net and either download the podcast on the audio side, read the episodes on the visual side, or download the Colbyjack Sunday Reader issues 1 through 46 in your choice of either EPUB or Mobi. Firmware, Hijacked, Proxy, and Keylogger are all available in ebook versions from our store at shop.colbyjack.net, Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and Smashwords.com. Just search for Colbytrax. That's Colbytrax. I'm the only one. A complete audiobook version of both Firmware, Hijacked, Proxy, and soon Keylogger is available for download through our shop as well. If you don't need any stuff, but would like to support our work, drop on by Colbyjack.net and hit the pretty little donate button conveniently located on the right-hand side of the blog roll. If you're on a smaller screen, the bottom will be found at the bottom of the page. Firmware Keylogger is released under a Creative Commons, non-commercial, attribution, share-alike license. Do what you want with it. Just don't sell it, and always tell people where it came from. If you received this from a friend and want more information about Colbyjack.net and our split personality website, just drop on over to Colbyjack.net and select either the audio or visual side. The audio side carries our podcast, while the visual side carries our writings. Whichever side catches your fancy is fine with us. We're of two minds about the whole thing anyway. I do mostly Twitter, so if you do the tweets and want to follow me, I'm Colbytrax. That's Colbytrax. Thank you once again. Remember to be fabulous and have a wonderful week.